In this lesson we're going to look at the absolute value function. Now when you write the absolute value, say the absolute value of x as I've written here, you use two vertical bars. They may resemble grouping symbols, but they aren't parentheses, they aren't braces, and they aren't brackets. Now as it turns out, they are treated like grouping symbols, but actually absolute value does more than that. Now it can be defined several different ways. One definition you sometimes see is that they will say the absolute value of x is x itself if x is greater than or equal to 0. And that basically means as long as x is not a negative number, the absolute value of x is x itself. Now, we also say that the absolute value of x is the opposite of x if x was less than 0. Again, that means negative. So, for some numerical examples, we can see that, for example, the absolute value of 5 is 5 because 5 is a positive number to begin with. The absolute value really had no effect upon it. But the absolute value of negative 5 would turn out to be a positive 5 because it was negative, therefore we took its opposite. So basically what we see happening here is that whenever you take the absolute value of some number, what comes out of that is not a negative number. Now you may say that that means it always comes out positive, but actually the absolute value of 0 is 0. So really, to be accurate, we need to say the absolute value is always a non-negative number because 0 is considered non-negative and it's also considered non-positive. Now absolute value can also be thought of, if you want to look at it in more of a graphical sense, if you look at your real number line with origin being right in the middle, when you say that the absolute value of 5 is 5, what that can also be interpreted to mean is that the real number 5 is a distance of 5 units, whatever units you choose to use to measure, but it is a distance of 5 units from the origin. And that's another reason why the absolute value of negative 5 turns out to be the same as the absolute value of 5, because it is also 5 units from the origin. Now, when you're working with absolute value, you have to remember that, like with other grouping symbols, it can only have an effect on whatever is inside of it. For example, absolute value of negative 7. Since negative 7 is a negative number, it turns into its opposite, which is positive 7. But if we write an absolute value type problem with a negative sign on the outside, you have to remember that that absolute value symbol can't do anything about that negative sign because it's not inside of it. So that would stay a negative 9 because the absolute value of 9 would still be 9, but this negative sign that was outside would come over onto the answer, which that can make things get a little bit tricky if you have a negative sign both outside and inside, because a lot of people would look at this and think, well, two negatives cancel each other. But that's not actually what's going to happen. This negative sign will disappear because it's within the absolute value symbols. The other negative sign will not, therefore the negative sign will come over into the answer. Don't get this confused with what happens when you're in a basic set of parentheses. In this case, the negative signs do cancel and you get the positive result. We can jump over to the calculator now and see how negatives are handled in that regard. Remember that your negative button is down here at the bottom. So if we want to put in a negative 3, that's how we key it in. Don't confuse the negative sign with the subtraction sign, because I can say negative 3 minus 5, and you see that the signs, those negative signs and the subtraction signs look a lot alike up there on the screen, but your computer or your calculator will not let you interchange them. If I say subtract 3, negative 5, Now, wait a minute, we got the answer coming up there. If I say subtract 3, it's thinking you want to take the answer and subtract 3 from it, and that's not what you're wanting to do. Now, for absolute value, if I want to take the absolute value of a number, we're going to hit the math button first, bump it over one place to the number column. Number 1 is the absolute value symbol, and yes, it does look different on the calculator than with pencil and paper. But if I want to take the absolute value of, say, negative 11, we don't want to forget to close the parentheses, and when we hit enter, there it is. If I want to take the opposite of the absolute value of negative 20, then that's how you key it in, and when you hit enter, you see that the absolute value got rid of the negative, but this other negative sign that wasn't inside got carried over into your answer, and that's the way that the calculator handles the negatives. Alright, so that's how absolute value works. It's good to think of it as a distance measuring tool, because that's what it will be used for a lot. But for now, it's simple enough to say that it gets rid of negative signs as long as they are inside of it. Positives stay the same, negatives become positive. And that's the main job of absolute value for now.